our team is back in Jerusalem, where we're about to climb up to the top of our fifth mountain. In most of the pictures that you see of Jerusalem, the gold dome stands out. It's an iconic structure that you see in the cityscape of Jerusalem. It shimmers in the sun. It stands out among all of the browns and the tans behind it. It is an iconic structure. It's actually a Muslim holy site. But the mountain that it sits on is an incredibly important stop in the panoramic picture of the Old Testament that we are painting. That's going to be our next mountain, our next stop. I'll see you there in just a minute.
In spite of all the lawlessness, idolatry, and turmoil of the period of the Judges, Israel was still God's chosen people and his treasured possession. But when Samuel arrived on the scene as an answer to Hannah's prayer, most of the nation's priests were corrupt, and many of its people were steeped in idolatrous ways. They were far from fulfilling the beautiful picture of a people set apart to present pure worship to their loving God. They were not stewarding the earth and representing his kingdom as they were called to do. Abraham's descendants were not blessing the rest of the world. A catastrophic defeat in battle drove the point home. The neighboring Philistines defeated Israel and captured the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred vessel that represented God's presence. In time, the Ark was returned, but the people began to cry out for a human king. God had always preferred to rule them directly, but he honored their desire and even blessed it. A loose confederation of tribes was united under a single king, and the age of disorder seemed to be over. But a human king cannot guarantee peace and order. Saul, the first king chosen by God, was impressive to human eyes. He looked the part, and for a while he lived it out. But not for long. He did not have a heart for God. He made too many spiritual compromises, and he made the mistake of seeing the kingdom as a matter of his glory rather than God's. Over time, through misplaced priorities and selfish pursuits, he became manic and paranoid, even trying to kill a young man who had served him well. So God chose another king. The young man Saul tried to kill was David, a bold young shepherd who followed God wholeheartedly. David even stood up to a giant named Goliath when no one in Israel's army was willing. God himself called David a man after his own heart. David prioritized worship and prayer, turning many prayers and praises into beautiful psalms we still read and sing. The transition between kings was traumatic. David fled the wrath of Saul for years, living as an exile in his own land and even beyond it. But these years of trial trained David for his calling as king and developed his faithfulness in the process. David made huge mistakes, and his kingdom suffered terrible consequences from them, but he repented freely when he was confronted with his sin. Because his heart always came back to God, God promised to establish his throne forever. But David had also longed to build a temple, a more permanent place than the tabernacle for worshiping God, and God would not let him. That privilege fell to David's son, Solomon, who became known for his wisdom, established the kingdom to its furthest extent, and presided over Israel's golden age, a time when he and many in his kingdom flourished. Through this glorious, thriving kingdom, God drew attention to his own glory. People of other nations were drawn to it. It became clear that God was not only interested in establishing a people for himself, he wanted a relationship with other nations too.
Well, we are back in a familiar place. In our first study together in Genesis chapter 22, Abraham was told to bring his son Isaac to Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah would later be known as Mount Zion. And so much has changed since we were here last time. Abraham was promised, remember, that he would be a father of a great nation with many descendants, and there would be a chosen people and a great nation. And all of that has come to pass. The Israelites are numerous and settled all around this land. The leadership of the people have transitioned from judges to kings, and there was King Saul and then King David and King Solomon. And King Solomon built this temple that was located on the top of the mountain where we are standing, on the top of Mount Zion. It's hard to overstate the importance of the temple for the Israelites. When the temple was dedicated on the top here of Mount Zion after 7 years of construction, we're told that the presence of God came and just dwelt here among the people. The temple was the source of identity for the people of God. It would have been seen as a sign of their security when it was standing strong here at Mount Zion. It was the place where all of the feasts and the festivals took place, where the sacrifice of animals was made over and over to deal with man's sin against God. People would travel from all over the land of the Old Testament to come here to worship at the temple. It was a place for all of the nations. As worshipers would come to the temple to worship, there was a collection of psalms from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134. We know them as the Psalms of Ascent. They're short psalms that the worshipers, they would sing or recite as they made their way up the side of Mount Zion on the way to worship at the temple. Psalm 130 is the one that I want to draw your attention to. Psalm 130 reads like this: "Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy. If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that we can with reverence serve you. I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord. More than watchmen wait for the morning. More than watchmen wait for the morning. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins." Just imagine reciting those words on the way up to the temple to offer a sacrifice. And knowing that you were coming to offer a sacrifice to God for the wrongs and the sins in your life, reciting these words, building anticipation. I know as I've walked through the city of David, which is down below, and thinking about coming up through the city up to this magnificent temple and thinking about these words: "Out of the depths I cried to you, Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy. If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that we can with reverence serve you." What a beautiful reminder of God's grace and forgiveness for the sinner. That without his forgiveness, we could not stand, but God made a way in the temple with the sacrifice of animals. Just try to imagine what it would be like for the ancient Israelite arriving here on this mountain, coming up this hill, and knowing that as you do, you are getting as close as you can to the presence of God. The temple that was behind me, you would have come up the hill and seen two large bronze columns begin to emerge over the horizon. And then this large 4-story structure begin to be seen, 90 feet long, 30 feet wide. They would have fit in the size of a basketball court for us. It was a courtyards, and then the holy place, and then the most holy place, the Holy of Holies that the high priest would only go in once a year to make atonement for sin. And you're coming up here knowing that as you arrive, ascend, singing these psalms, you're getting as close to the presence of God as you can. It is a privilege to be here on Mount Zion, to think about all of the religious significance of what happened here, to think about all the pilgrims who came for centuries to worship here. And people still come on the western side of the wall, the famous western wall where Jews flocked to pray, believing that's as close to where God's presence was as they could be. And even today, Christian worshipers come knowing that Jesus came to the temple to worship. And as significant as all of that is, I'm absolutely astonished by what the New Testament tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? For centuries, people would come to this mountain, Mount Zion, right here, because they believed this was as close as they could get to the presence of God. But now we're told in 1 Corinthians 3 that if you're a follower of Jesus, God's Spirit dwells in you. You and I are God's temple. What a dramatic shift that is from the Old Testament to the New. People don't have to come to a temple to worship and find the presence of God. Now we are temples going out, taking the presence of God to the world. What a tremendous thought. And if that's true, then can I ask us some really important questions? If you consider the splendor and the majesty of the Old Testament temple, and now that all of that somehow through God's Spirit lives in us, is there anything that needs to change about our life, about our priorities, about what we value, about what we live for? If God moved His presence from a place to a person and then sent those people out, not to a mountain, but out into the world, are we representing God's presence as the temple of God well? Are we sharing His love at work, at school, in our neighborhoods? Are we the message of hope that we find in Psalm 130? Put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with Him is full redemption. As people encounter us, is that the message that they hear? Is that the message that we are taking to the world? Now, what a privilege it is to not have to ascend to a mountain to experience the presence of God, but to know that we experience His presence and take His presence to the world around us. What a remarkable privilege, and what a weighty responsibility. I'll see you in a minute.
It was clear during the reigns of David and Solomon that God lived among His people. The kingdom grew, and during Solomon's reign, the people experienced peace on every side. God's kingdom on earth always flourishes in one way or another when His people put Him first and follow His ways. But although Solomon started well, he did not finish well. He accomplished great things, like building the temple and a palace and earning international esteem. But he compromised in numerous ways. His building projects exhausted the people and at times exploited their labor. He often relied on horses and chariots more than on God. He made unwise alliances with other kingdoms that undermined Israel's pure devotion to God. And many of those alliances came in the form of marriages to daughters of foreign kings, women who would turn Solomon's heart toward worship of their pagan gods. In the end, the king who prayed for wisdom unwisely built idolatrous shrines. Solomon wrote numerous proverbs and a remarkable love poem, but he became disillusioned by his own extravagance and misplaced priorities. He gave himself to power and wealth, and eventually realized that life on earth under the sun, apart from its God-given meaning, was futile and fruitless. He did not follow his own wisdom to the end. Solomon's reign, marked by his split loyalties, is almost like a tale of two kings, and eventually, two kingdoms. His wholehearted devotion to God's ways turned, over time, into a divided heart devoted to trying to fit God's ways into his own and finding it impossible. And the king with a divided heart would leave behind a soon-to-be divided kingdom.
I'm here at the Western Wall on the west side of the Temple Mount. The Jewish people today have limited access to the top of the Temple Mount, and so they come here to pray at the Western Wall, believing this is as close as they can get to where the presence of God was in the temple. It's a pretty moving experience. Often they'll write prayers onto little pieces of paper and fold them and stick them into the cracks in the wall, and then come here and just pray. It's moving to watch and to experience. But I'm reminded of our lesson from Psalm 130, that God's presence is not at a place in a building, but as believers in us. And we have been called as believers to take God's presence to the world and to make His love and His forgiveness known to the world around us. I hope you have been inspired and encouraged by our study of Psalm 130 this week. Listen, I want to encourage you. It's time now for you to jump into your study questions, maybe as an individual or as a group. I want you to take some time and just work through those questions, be open and honest and transparent with each other. And then I want to really encourage you this week to read in the Bible reading schedule. Be reading those Psalms of Ascent and think about reading those as you are coming up here to the Temple Mount. So study with the questions and then read this week, and we'll see you soon. God bless.